segment of the research interview series, I'd like to welcome Dr. Unani Bhromeill. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome, Ray. Delighted to be here.
Can I start by asking you, how did you come to study American history?
Well, when I went to UCG in 1980, which is now NUIG, there was a very broad choice of history programmes to choose from, one of which was American history, so I was introduced to it at that stage. I went on, mind you, to do my MA in Irish history at UCG, but in 1989 I got the opportunity to apply to a PhD programme in Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in the United States, and I took that and was accepted onto the PhD programme. And the PhD programme in the United States at the time was very different to a research PhD here in Ireland. It had taught modules on various aspects of American history and other history, and also you had comprehensive exams which you had to do before you actually were allowed on to do the thesis. So I took modules on ethnicity, I took modules on immigration, I took modules on slavery, I took modules on urban history. In the urban history module there was a field trip to New York, and the lecturer advised us to look up rather than keep our eyes at eye level, and I really did feel that was a metaphor for my time in the United States. And I went on to do my PhD thesis on Irish Americans and cultural nationalism in the United States, and from then on really I stuck with American history, and I was very immersed in American history, and then of course there was an American history programme here at Mary Immaculate College, so it was a very nice fit.
How do you stay at the forefront of your research in US history?
I think there are two aspects to sticking with your research, particularly when I live on the other side of the Atlantic. One is keeping with the sources, and the other is disseminating your research. And I try as far as possible to visit the United States as regularly as I can, to visit archives and repositories there, particularly the New York Public Library and the National Archives in Maryland. But I need also to be very creative because I can't be there all the time. And so therefore I do a lot of work on Irish American newspapers. We're very lucky here at Mary Immaculate College to have full runs of the key Irish American newspapers, the Gaelic American and the Irish World. And we also have databases incorporating the New York Times, Chicago Defender, Chicago Tribune, the New York or the San Francisco Chronicle, all of which contribute to my research work and to looking at primary sources here in Ireland. With regard to research dissemination, I presented conferences in the United States. I try to present at a conference there every year, not just history conferences, but also interdisciplinary conferences. And I suppose it's very important to put your work out there, to make contacts in your research field. Also, I suppose, to allow discussion of your research material, because you can be very alone in doing that work. And I find that conferences provide that. They also provide, obviously, a great deadline for actually writing that work. And what I've found is at conferences, editors of journals come up to you and they say, well, I'd like to publish your article. So it's also a good spur to actually publishing your work, to actually present this work at conferences. And you make connections as well, that you can collaborate with people on books or in book chapters. So I find that that is very good from the point of view of actually deadlines for producing your research and also for publications afterwards. The one thing I'll say is that talking always to academic audiences is not always the way to disseminate your research. I give talks to local history associations which have very broad interests and are very interested in American history, and that's a good way to get your research work out there. But also, of course, you can get a national and sometimes even international audience with radio documentaries and with television documentaries. I've done a number of television documentaries which have been shown in Ireland and the United States and even in Australia on research that I have done, and contributed to those as a participant. And that's a great way of disseminating your research. So I think from that point of view, it gives you a spur, it makes you put your work out there, and it also gives it an audience. And I think that's a way of keeping up with your research.
What is on your current research agenda?
I'm working on quite different things at the moment. I'm focusing on political cartoons in the pre-World War I period. I've just completed 2 articles, one on representations of John Bull in the Irish World, and the other on I suppose, images and perceptions of John Redmond in political cartoons in the Irish world also. Because political cartoons are a fascinating window into the way people understood their world at the time, on things people took for granted. So there's a lot of iconography in the cartoons, and so you can get an insight into that world. So that's one of my research focuses at the moment. I suppose my main research focus is on an Irish-American patron of the arts, a man called John Quinn, who was known at the time as the Man from New York. And I came across him initially in my PhD because he organised Douglas Hyde's trip to the United States in 1906. Quinn was a fascinating character. He was a lawyer, a patron of the arts. He defended Joyce and the publication of Joyce's Ulysses in New York. He organised W.B. Yeats's tours to the United States. He organised Douglas Hyde's tours to the United States. He funded Joyce. He funded Joseph Conrad. He funded Ford Madox Ford in their writing. But he was also an avid collector of modern art. In fact, he was one of the instigators, and he opened the Armory Show, which is the first modern art show in America, in New York, in 1913, which is exactly 100 years ago now. But John Quinn is a historian's dream. He left a cache of letters and papers and of his letters to other people and their replies to him. And he's witty, he's cynical, he's enthusiastic, he puts his money where his mouth was. And in 2009, I was awarded a senior fellowship from the Gilder Lehrman Institute in New York to look at his impact as a power broker in the United States. And I travelled to the New York Public Library and spent the January of 2010 there looking at his papers. And I would spend the day with his life, thinking his thoughts, and then emerge blinking into the New York night, which was even better. And I'm still working on that project. I'm working towards a book on John Quinn as a broker of influence in the United States, and that's, I suppose, my key research project right now.
How do you integrate teaching and research?
It's very important to get students to get to the primary sources for themselves, so they can see for themselves, for example, what the Emancipation Proclamation meant when Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863. So the newspaper sources that we have here at Mary I, particularly the 19th century database, is particularly invaluable for students and for teaching students about that era. I teach all American history on the undergraduate program, and so I use a lot of my research work, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, on political cartoons. You have Herblock, for example, in the 20th century with cartoons of Nixon. And you have Thomas Nast, particularly in the 19th century, with images of Boss Tweed and Irish Americans. And so this is a very important part of actually getting to the primary sources and integrating that with teaching. From the point of view of final year projects or the undergraduate dissertation, we tend in the history department to try and focus on our research strengths. So some of our students who would go abroad to America, I work with them on their final year projects, and others who don't have the opportunity to go on placement abroad to the United States, we work here, particularly on Irish American newspapers or how Irish topics are actually reported in the Irish press. So you can integrate the research into your teaching from that point of view. On our postgrad programme, I teach image-based research to the taught MA programme. And that works very, very well because I look at photographs in particular, also at political cartoons and at the odd advertisement, mostly in American history, but sometimes also in Irish history.
You mentioned interdisciplinarity earlier. What do you mean by this?
I suppose because I have been curious about where my own research has brought me, where Leeds have thrown up interesting approaches to history. I've been open to thinking about methodology and ideas in other disciplines. I suppose to explore new ways of thinking, to explore new ways of seeing, and also to be influenced by other disciplines. and I suppose to be impacted by the way other scholars approach material, not just by their ideas, which can be fascinating in themselves, but by their methodologies. And it's one of the reasons, I suppose, particularly that I have presented at conferences like the American Educational Research Conference on the formation of female teachers in the 19th century here in Ireland, and also at the International Visual Sociology Association on some of the photographs that I got from that research and that I worked on from that research, and also on political cartoons. So presenting and hearing other ways of doing things at these conferences, I think, opens your mind in your own field. And even though the discipline of history is very established, I think there have been many ways of approaching it. There's been political history, social history, oral history, gender history, and each part or each approach provides a fragment of the past. And when you put those together, you can actually have a very rich, I suppose, exploration of history. And sometimes I think as historians we need to unpick or to unpack elements of what we see so that we get to a core. And sometimes we only have fragments. We've got to build something up. So there are different ways of coming at doing historical research. So I suppose to provide a more coherent story, a story with evidence, you can use different methodologies, and I found that interdisciplinary ways can help me with my research agenda, because there are multiplicities in the past just as there are in the present. It's never just one experience, and so sticking to one way of doing things I think can be limiting, and that's why I like to explore interdisciplinary ways of doing research and different methodologies.
Could you tell me about supervising postgraduate students in American history at MA and PhD level?
You know, it can be difficult to win over students to do research MAs and PhDs in American history because we're so far from American repositories and research archives. But I have supervised research students who have done work in American history and who've managed to travel on short research trips to the United States to gather information and data, and who've then completed their research here. Also, there are significant repositories which are digitized and which are online. I had a student who completed an MA on Margaret Sanger because so much of her writing and her papers were actually digitized online, and she was able to do that with a short research trip. And as I mentioned previously, Mary Immaculate College has a wonderful collection of 19th century and 20th century Irish American and American newspapers, papers which are not available elsewhere in the country and which are only available in the United States. So we have a very rich repository here from the point of view of print culture in the 19th and 20th century. And so we welcome MA and PhD students. Our taught MA has also provided a window of opportunity for students to engage in a 20,000 word dissertation in an area of American history which they can complete here. And I think that has opened an avenue to do more in-depth research in American history at Mary Immaculate College.
What advice could you give to new scholars who are trying to develop their research profile?
I think the first thing I would say is put your work out into the world. Go to conferences, make connections, take opportunities to develop your research ideas and your research leads, I suppose. The second thing I would say is do not be afraid of rejection. It is part and parcel of academic life. But even if your article is rejected for a journal, you'll get valuable feedback once you've stopped crying. And that will help you to redo your article or to reposition your article, and it will make it better. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is to take time to think. We spend an awful lot of time talking about product and production. And writing proposals and writing chapters. But sometimes you forget that you actually need to think about your ideas so that they can develop into something that's actually worth reading or hearing about.
Una, thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure, Maria.